every age, the towers of thought crumble. Yet upon timeless foundations, we build again. Higher, wiser, whole.
In the last discussion we had, I talked about how everyone starts building a paradigm, their worldview, their map of reality, their light of life, with an assumption, a core belief, a simple answer to the most fundamental question of life. Now, obviously, the question that may be in your mind now is, how do you know if your answer is correct or not? Or, more simply put, what is truth? You know how Jesus asked Pontius Pilate, what is truth? You know how the verse says, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So what is truth? How do you define truth? You know, for most people, the answer to this question is quite simple. Like, for example, I did also mention this in my book. For some people, it's just as simple as say, the word of God is truth, or anything that aligns to reality is truth. But again, the question needs to be asked, what is reality? How do you define reality? And what do you determine what is reality? There's something I said in the book which is quite interesting, which is, if I sent you to find a man, like I said, go to the next city and find me a certain man, and the man is called truth, and you bring me the man. Or I just say, go find a man. If I don't give you a specific description of who that man is, what his name is, how he looks like, and all of that, how are you going to find that man? How are you going to know when you find the man that I want? So a word like truth is a very big word. It's a very loaded word. But what exactly is truth? How do you describe that word? Now, I'm going to attempt to take you through a journey to describe my understanding of what is truth. And I'm going to take you to the Hebrew word for truth. And there's a reason why the Hebrew word. If you read my book, I explained, and I answered the question, why Hebrew? So, the Hebrew word for truth is emet, and it's a very interesting word. It's made up of 3 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The first letter, the middle letter, and the last letter of the alphabet. Also, each of those letters have a flat base, a broad base, which means if you were to place them to stand, they have a broad base to stand on. They're more solid. That's very interesting because think about it. The letters that forms the Hebrew word for truth, you have the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the middle letter, and the last letter. Okay. So what does that tell us? That tells us that truth is completeness. Truth is wholeness. Like, it's not just something that sounds right, but it's complete and it's whole. And also, like I mentioned, that the letters also have a broad base, means they can stand, means truth have legs to stand on. You know, when someone is telling you a lie, when someone is telling a story that is not true, you can see how the story doesn't have legs to stand on. You ask questions and you see how the story begins to wobble, and you see how things begin to fall out of place. That's how lies sound. But truth would always stand solid. The person tells the story, it's consistent. And one easy way to know, for example, I tell you a little trick. One way to know that someone is lying is that they cannot tell the same story every time they tell that story. Every time they tell the story, something changes, and it is changing and constantly changing. And so maybe you ask someone a question today and ask them same question about same thing the next 2 or 3 months down the road, they're going to tell you something else, or they're going to tell you with slight changes in the story, and then you're going to be able to see that the story doesn't have legs to stand on, and then you see that it's not. So the first letter of the Hebrew word for truth, emet, is aleph, and it's a letter that represents God. That represents God. So you have God as the source of truth. Now, again, we talked about the soul identity, the first identity, the first principle, the first answer to that question, is there God or is there no God? That's going to be the source of your truth. If you say there's no God, that is going to be the defining center of what becomes your truth or your paradigm of reality. If you say there's God, then that also becomes that center, that source. Now, so we have aleph. Now, the remaining letters of the Hebrew alphabet spells the Hebrew word for death. So you have God plus death, truth. If you take away the source out of it, you have death. Now, that's also very interesting. Also, if you separate the Hebrew words, like the first 2 letters, you have the Hebrew word for mother, like a mother that gives birth and nourishes a child. Now, if you add the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet to that, which is taf, if you add it to the Hebrew word for mother, it gives you the Hebrew word for truth. Truth is a mother that gives birth to life and sustains it right up to the end. So truth is consistent. Truth will take you all the way. So truth is the mother that gives birth to a life, nourishes the life up unto completion. If you watch my previous teachings or and you've read my book, you will see how I mentioned my deep need for consistency, how something has to be consistent all the way. You don't have to keep patching it up like you're building a Frankenstein monster, just trying to patch one truth or one doctrine or one ideology on a core principle just so that it should make sense. Truth has to be consistent all through the way. It has to keep nourishing your life all through the way. Now, the thing with a paradigm is a paradigm that is not based on truth, as we've defined in this case. At some point, you will not be able to sustain the weight of the realities of your life. I'm going to talk about this in a moment and give you more practical examples so that you see exactly what I mean by that. At some point, a paradigm that is not built in truth will not be able to sustain the realities and the experiences of your life. And you're going to be found wanting with no legs to stand on. We've said that truth has legs to stand on. So we have Ima for mother, plus the Hebrew word for completeness, taf, the Hebrew letter for completeness, we get truth. So truth endures, is life that endures from the beginning up until the end. So you could start up something and say, this is truth, but let's watch you along the way. Let's watch you meet your journey, and let's watch at the end and see the results of what it produces. Truth is what holds together. Truth is what stays real, reliable, and life-giving from the start to the finish. Truth is always wholeness that works. It connects where things come from and how they unfold and from where they ultimately lead. This is quite important. We're going to talk about this a little bit more as we progress. Now, imagine that a child goes to the garden and sees a very beautiful flower and plucks out the flower, brings it to the parents and say, look, I found this very beautiful flower. I love it so much. And then I plucked it. And they brought the flower. And then 3 days later, he sees that the flower is withered and died and changed. And he's shocked. My beautiful flower, what happened? What happened is that the flower was detached from the source. So you can see how powerful the first answer to the biggest fundamental question of life determines how truth works in your life. So you start by answering the biggest fundamental question, which is, how do we come to find ourselves in this world? And as we discussed in the previous discussions, that answer has to be, at some point, a leap of faith. It has to be a choice that you make. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Hebrew word for falsehood, sheker. Now, sheker is made of the last 3 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they are mixed up, and the individual letters itself has a narrow base that you can stand them on their feet. So the very nature of falsehood is that it's not complete. First of all, it's the last Hebrew letters of the alphabet. You know, there's something the sages say that a wise man is the one that can determine a tree from the seed. You look at the seed and you can already determine the kind of tree it's going to be. You look at so a wise person can look at the way a certain behavior way before it produces fruit and can tell that behavior is going to lead to pain. But a foolish person would only be able to know that this behavior or these actions or this seed is going to lead to pain only when it's happened. Now, sheker is incomplete. It doesn't stand well on its feet. It has no legs, and you have to keep patching it and managing it. I'll tell you a story that might help really drive this point home. See, there's this little city, and they had an old bridge that was made up of wood. Reminds me of one particular bridge. And so generations and generations have been using that bridge. Farmers use the bridge and they go to the farm. Traders use the bridge and they cross along. But life has advanced. Technology has advanced. Lots of things. Society has changed. The mayor of the town said, well, we're going to be a modern bridge. We're going to be a bridge of concrete and big bridges that can have cars pass on it and have all these trucks with food pass on it and all of that stuff. And so they brought the engineers that were to work on it, and the mayor did not want to spend extra money to change the foundations of the bridge. So he insisted that a new bridge should be built on the foundations of the old bridge, which has served the city for generations. And behold, they went through that and they built a new bridge, and it kept serving and serving and serving. The vehicles were passing, but underneath it was cracking and breaking. And eventually one day, the whole bridge collapsed and fell. And everyone in the village lost confidence. It was no loss of life, but everyone in that city lost confidence in something that has stood solid for generations, and they had relied on solid for generations. Now, think about your life. There are certain things that could happen to your life that your framework of reality cannot explain why it's happening. Again, I give you good examples. Say suffering or pain, when bad things happen to innocent people, when you've done your very best and you've been very, very good behavior and something so unfortunate happens to you. If you subscribe to a particular worldview, there are big questions that come up that you will not be able to answer in that worldview. You'll be like, I thought that if I were just a good person and I did everything right, my life would turn out right. But my life has turned out so terrible. And then I look down the street and there's Johnny Bravo, who did everything opposite in the wrong direction, but their lives are just fine. Now, my worldview cannot answer that. And then I find myself holding a map that cannot help me navigate the complexity of my experiences. So your truth, your world of truth can collapse. And usually it happens when that can no longer sustain or it no longer matches the reality of your experience. And that was my life, where everything I had thought to believe. Remember in a previous discussion, I mentioned how many years ago, I was ministering in the church, and I read this verse, and I said, remember this verse, David said that I was young and I'm old, I've never seen the righteous forsaken. How many of you believe that, by show of hands, that the righteous, this verse is true, that the righteous can never be forsaken? And I think everyone put up their hands. That's because you've been conditioned that the Bible is true, and it's always true. And so if the Bible says the righteous cannot be forsaken, even if your lived experience every day is that you see righteous people being forsaken, you can't accept that. You have to insist that the Bible is true. And this ultimately can work in areas where your life is not critically dependent on that truth working. But when it comes to a point where your life is critically dependent on that truth working, there's only an extent to which you can fake it. You can make believe, because at some point you really need to make your life work. At some point the pain is unbearable, the depression is unbearable, and all of that stuff. And which is where I eventually found myself, where I've been mentioning that with time I'm going to throw more breadcrumbs around that with regards to my experience. There's a word for when a person's worldview, a person's truth, or a person's belief system collapses under pressure of experience, under the weight of reality, of a contrast, of something you're experiencing that is so real and is so damaging and is so heavy in your life. But again, your experiences, your truth is telling you different. So I remember a story where there was this particular movement I was part of, and they had a belief that it's one of the Apostles' Creed of that movement. They believe that if you're a believer in Jesus, you cannot be oppressed by demons, or you cannot be oppressed by evil spirits. Now, there was this particular person in that movement that was terribly oppressed by evil spirits. And every time they brought up the issue of the oppression, they would say something like, oh, you just need to believe the truth. And the truth is that you cannot be oppressed by these evil spirits. And because you're a believer in God and all of that stuff. But the person's lived experience was horrible. We had these spirits that were driving the person insane. And eventually this killed the person. But I remember other members in the movement, it was a wake-up call for some people, like, okay, it's that moment, because death is that undeniable, shocking reality that once you're confronted with it, it makes you think. It makes you really think. And so when that happened to this person, I remember other people in the movement were like, okay, this was that moment where you have this belief that you know to be true and self-evident, but you have a lived experience that doesn't align. And when, like I said, that you can make believe all you want, but there's a time when making believe becomes extremely costly. You need it to work, and that's really when most people have their belief collapse and they jump into the dark night of the soul. And that state, it's cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is no small thing. Something I experienced a lot back then. Is when belief and reality clash so hard that the mind cannot reconcile it. You have something so real, and then you have belief that you believe to be so true, and they clash so hard that the mind cannot reconcile, because both equally stand in major contrast and major contradiction to each other. Or you have a paradigm collapse or a crisis of meaning. I also had that. This is when your entire framework collapses. What's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of all this? What's the purpose of all this? Or a dark night of the soul. This is when the old light no longer reaches the depths, or the old lights that have once lighted your soul and brought you joy no longer reaches the depths of your soul. Or the worst of them, existential crisis. You see, it's when you question what is true. So this is when your life has expanded beyond your belief. Your realities can no longer hold together on the old foundations. Your old foundations and the old structure of your belief can no longer carry the weight of your reality and your experience, so it cracks. And this is when things that used to make sense no longer make sense. They're no longer tied together. And this could happen. It could drive you insane. It could put you in a lot of pain. Or you could just be brutally stubborn like I used to be and decide to just keep soldiering on anyway and keep making believe anyway and just keep trying to patch the monster of doctrines and patching it and doing all kinds of gymnastics to make it feel consistent and make it make sense. And when it doesn't make sense, you lift up your hands in your head and say, oh, the wisdom of God is so great that it's like foolishness to man. I know this thing is foolish, but the only reason it's foolish is because it's a wisdom of God that is so high. So you embrace all of that, and you can keep soldiering it like that for so long. But at some point, like I arrived at a point like, this is no way to live. That you continue living like this, I'd rather die. And I had to find something that works. I had to really find a life that makes sense and that can sustain and explain all my experiences, a wide range of my experiences, and the experiences of those that were around me that I deeply cared about. So we've talked about emet, truth, the first letter, the middle letter, and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And again, if you're not sure why I used Hebrew to be that point where I try to illustrate my understanding of truth, you want to read in the book. There's a whole section for why Hebrew. And again, if you also listen to the last episode where I talked about why it is that I chose to believe that there is God. See, I said I chose. I don't know. I don't have any evidence beyond reasonable doubt that I can share with you that to prove that there's no God. I know you might be thinking and quoting that verse to me, which says that in the Bible, I think in the book of Proverbs, that say a fool says that there's no God. Again, that's the kind of things that doesn't really fly if you really want to be serious. If you want to be serious, you just can take that verse and use it as a hammer to shut down people. That if anybody is not believing, it's not God. And remember, I mentioned the verse also in the book of Hebrew 11 verse 6 that you need faith to believe in God. So the verse says that without faith, you need faith to know, to believe that God exists. So believing in God is a matter of faith. Believing that there is no God is also a matter of faith. It's a choice you make, and you have to be conscious about that choice, and you have to know why you're making that choice. My book goes into depth into the choice I made and why I made that choice. So in the next teaching, we're going to talk about, all right, now that you've made a choice that there is God, because there's the question to answer the most fundamental question of life, which is, how do we get to find ourselves in this world? Then there is the question that follows, now that we're in this world, what is the purpose of life? How do we do life? What is valuable in life? What is life worth for? What is a good life? And what is a life worth living? You answer all those questions. Now, then there is something in the world called death. It's a reality that everyone is familiar with. It's not one of those kind of realities where you can make believe, you can fake it away and all of that. It's something that is so staggeringly imposing as a reality in our world. So yes, there is death. Now you've answered the question, this is a life worth living, but why does it matter if you're going to die and everything is going to end? So then there's the question about death. You need to answer the question of what happens thereafter. And so we're going to dive into something a little bit to try to touch that on the surface in the next discussion. But this is something that I delve into in great depth in my book. So if you can get a copy of my book, please do. If you can't, it's also okay. I think you can find lots of value in these discussions we are having. I experienced a terrible dark night of the soul where the map that I had for reality, the framework that I had for reality could not stand under the weight of the experiences that I had come to have in my life. And like I said, that you can make believe all you want, but there's a point where your life depends on that thing you believe working, that thing you believe making sense in the world and explaining things for you and making your life, your light, shining a light on your path. And so if eventually that doesn't happen, there's only how much you can continue to go on. And I experienced a dark night of the soul where I couldn't go on anymore, and I had to search, and I had to search for something that makes sense, that could really shine a light on my life and really give me a path to live this life and do this life in a way that is really fulfilling. If you're that person and you're that hungry and my voice is shining light to your soul, it's bringing comfort, that's all the reward that I seek in writing this book and releasing these videos. If I could save one soul, one person, the turmoil of a dark night of the soul, of an existential crisis, of the cognitive dissonance, of the depression and the suicidalness, if I can save just one person, then it's great accomplishment for me. And you, what you could do is, if you're finding value in this, the way algorithms work, you can share it with someone. Wherever you're watching this, you can like it, you can share, you can subscribe. This will cause the algorithm to show it to more people, and hopefully we're going to find more people that we can save from a dark night of the soul, and we can help them not suffer as I suffered and not suffer as maybe you're suffering. So let's discuss in the next discussion about, now that we've answered the question about how we came to find ourselves in this world, whatever your answer is, if your answer was that there's no God, we just found ourselves here to a random act of evolution, or your answer is that there is God, then of course let's talk about the next question. What's a life worth living? How do you do life? What's valuable in life? What's the purpose of your life? What's the meaning of life? And all the things that has to do with doing life. And then the last big question is, but again, why does all that matter if we are going to die? Should we say like someone, let's live, let's marry, let's wine, let's enjoy, because we all die and this thing is vanity upon vanity and makes no sense? Let's have this discussion in the next episode.
In every age, the towers of thought crumble, yet upon timeless foundations we build again, higher, wiser, whole,